Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, I'm Fred Murphy with the Marxist Education Project. I'd like to welcome you to the event on capitalist terrorists, Klansmen, lawmen, and employers in the long 19th century with author Chad Pearson. Chad is the author of the book, of course, and a labor historian at the University of North Texas. Has another book called Reform or Repression, Organizing America's Anti-Union Movement, and has published essays in Jacobin, Counterpunch, Monthly Review, and other journals. Chad's going to talk for, I don't know, 40, 45 minutes.
Yeah, half an hour
or,
thereabouts.
or a half hour,
Yeah.
as long as he needs, I told him. And then we'll throw it open for Q&A and discussion and comments. So just turn it over to Chad. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Fred, and thank you to the Marxist Education Project, and thank you for all of you who took some time out of your Saturday to be here. I feel very, very honored. So I want to I've got a PowerPoint. Can everybody see this okay? Yes? Okay, fantastic. So I want to sort of pose a question, though I don't necessarily need people to answer, and that is, sort of what comes to mind when you think about the word terrorist? I think it's fair to say that we probably imagine since 9/11 that it would be a bearded Muslim man, probably from the Middle East somewhere, and that of course, that may be changing in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. But in general, I think it's fair to say that this is sort of the image that comes up in the public arena. Of course, the word has been used and abused for many, many years, and if we go back to the turn of the century, those who shaped the narrative of the time often referred to immigrant anarchists and socialists as terrorists as well, and so I think that there's been a tendency to kind of label that the dominant, the more powerful folks in society have almost had a monopoly on labeling certain people terrorists, and of course have done so for political reasons. Of course, we know the saying, or many of us know the saying, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. At the same time, we probably can identify terrorism when we see it. So what I want to do today is sort of make a case that folks, more privileged folks in the late 19th and early 20th century involved in different vigilante organizations were themselves terrorists. And I say this because I think if we look at what their victims said, many of their victims would often refer to their activities as constituting terrorism, and sometimes spokespersons for these organizations would even use the word terror to describe their activities. And so in making that case, my book focuses primarily on the Ku Klux Klan, various law and order leagues, stockgrowers associations, and citizens alliances. Now, what's interesting about these organizations is that in the context of their violent activities, they often justified their activities by invoking the concept of law and order, which may seem sort of paradoxical, right? Breaking the law to uphold the law. But the language of law and order was very, very commonplace, very common during this time. And so members of all of these organizations really understood the relationship between violence and economic self-interest. Violence and economic self-interest. They engaged in violent activities because it served their interest. It served their economic and managerial goals. Okay, it served their economic and managerial goals. And so in making this case, I'm sort of challenging certain assumptions that cut against the grain of much scholarship. I think for most business historians, um, the architects and beneficiaries of the Second Industrial Revolution, that is the time after the Civil War up through World War I, when the United States became the dominant economic power. These historians, generally talk about improvements in factories, maybe Taylorism, scientific management, programs designed to win the loyalty of workers, and that business people are, sort of hard-headed managers who culturally are, dine in fancy restaurants and go to spend time in exclusive clubs, and they're well mannered, and they really had distanced themselves from the dangerous classes, that is the working classes, the immigrant working classes. But what I show in my book is that many of these people had a violent side, right? And that they got their own hands dirty, right? So I guess sort of two of the key points I seek to make in the book is, one, to look at sort of primitive forms of management, that is, different forms of violence, and to challenge this idea that these people were always, hard-headed, well-organized, shop floor managers and whatnot, and also to challenge the image of them, that they were sort of, very proper and refined and whatnot. So many, of course, did get their hands dirty in direct conflicts with workers of various sorts, and so again, looking at the relationship between vigilantism and management. So in making the case, I talk about what I call hard, soft, and hybrid forms of repression. Hard, soft, and hybrid forms of repression. So a hard form might be something like whippings or kidnappings or lynchings, physical activity that resulted in harm and or death of the victims. I talk about right, and so a hard form, of course, lynchings, shooting at people, hanging people, that kind of thing. Soft forms I discuss include firings, blacklisting, and book burning, or the destruction of literature, the mobilization against meetings, leftist meetings, and so these did not leave physical scars necessarily, but they were very traumatic. Some folks burned books in public. Firing, of course, very scary for ordinary people to get fired. And then blacklisting. There are some who talked about what they called the terrors of the blacklist, right? And what firings and blacklistings did was they both punished the target, but they also sent a message to others as well, just like some of the hard forms of repression. And what I have here up on the screen is a book by Asa Mercer, who wrote about the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association's raid in Johnson County, and members of that organization burned the book and tried to suppress it to the extent possible. And then on the right side of the screen is Martin Irons, who was a leader of the 1886 Southwest Railroad strike and was blacklisted and spent the last 14 years of his life really suffering. So he was sort of an example of how not to behave according to the ruling class. And then I talk about what I call hybrid forms. And really there's just one that I mention in the book. And these are drive-out campaigns. So they could be either violent or bloodless. So a violent one, so basically what would happen is you'd have these members of these vigilante organizations. They would approach somebody at their house or community, and they would demand that they leave by a certain time, right? You better get out by the time the sun comes up, or you got two hours to get out of here, get your belongings and leave. Okay, and if these people resisted, there would be maybe forced removal, maybe some whippings. If they did not, it was a bloodless event, and they would leave semi-voluntarily. And so the bloodless ones involved what I call, there's a four-step process. That is, you would isolate, you would intimidate, you would expel, and then you would blacklist. Right? So you want to have a group of people who overwhelm the individual or small groups of people. Right? You intimidate them, you expel them, and then you blacklist them, prevent them from coming back. And so these were practiced by a number of folks in my study. Right? The idea is to remove the troublemaker. The outcome was the same. That is the removal of these unwanted individuals. And again, in all of these cases, the vigilantes, the terrorists, would often insist that they were committed to upholding law and order. So I want to ask another question, and that is, why did these employer terrorists feel emboldened to do this work? And I think the case is pretty clear that they had plenty of folks in positions of power who I call the enablers, right? We're talking about judges, police forces, state militia, federal troops, generally sided with employers in the context of labor unrest, particularly in high-profile cases where the governors would declare martial law. You have cases, joint public-private clampdowns involving troops and private vigilantes. We can identify such events from, say, the 1877 railroad strike all the way to the Bisbee deportation in 1917. And, you'd have troops assisting. The court system, I think it's fair to say, including the Supreme Court, much more likely to issue injunctions against striking workers than to penalize thuggish bosses. The Supreme Court issued a number of decisions throughout the 19th and early 20th century that tended to be very favorable to the business community. As one historian noted, the Supreme Court was the most powerful instrument of the ruling class. We also have state laws and federal laws that criminalized anarchists and, of course, clamped down on them, deported them as well. And so, and then, of course, we have high-profile labor activists sent to their deaths. The most famous or infamous, probably the Haymarket case, the death of Joe Hill. And so you have this. The enablers. Now, I don't want to overstate the involvement of state forces. There are very important exceptions. Perhaps the most important was the federal government's clamp down on the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s, and you have court system that will. People couldn't just shoot at people. There were, they would go to court, but often would have high-profile lawyers often get off in a number of cases, which my book discusses. And in the case of the Klan, which I think is perhaps most important, you have the official ending of the first Klan in the early 1870s, but many of the high-profile leaders did not get indicted or convicted, and then of course racist violence in the South continued well into the late 19th and early 20th century. And so I talk about the terrorists, I talk about the enablers, and then I discuss what I call the narrative creators, those who sought to legitimize the work of union busters, strike breakers, vigilantes more broadly. And of course, newspapers was a big source at this time. There were novelists. There were hundreds in the late 19th century. There were hundreds of novels, sort of labor problem novels that highlighted the labor problem, that looked at the the disgruntled workers and the dangerous classes, and sort of celebrated the employers. Clergymen, of course, professors, academic administrators. What I have here is a picture of Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard University, who in 1896 and again in 1902 talked about the strikebreaker, what he called the scab, as the hero of American industry. Okay, and so these folks helped to create a climate that offered legitimacy to a lot of the thuggery that was unleashed by different vigilante groups. And so let's talk a little bit. I want to turn your attention now to some of the players here who I mentioned. I don't think there should be any debate that the first Klan, or any Klan for that matter, was a terrorist organization. They were terrorists. But there's a tendency, I think, to look at white supremacist violence and to focus on hate. And indeed, these were hateful people. But in my book, I talk more about exploitation. Okay, I ask the question, what were the Klan's interests? What did they want? Right? Were they all about just going around and killing people? Well, they killed quite a few. Probably, I've seen. I think the best estimate I have is about 3,000 people during the Reconstruction time period. But what they really wanted was to assist planters and other elites, in some of whom wore both hats. They were planters and Klansmen. They wanted the former enslaved people to work, right? Get back onto the plantations, get into the kitchens, go back to the farms and work, right? And so racism serves sort of a function here. I argue that the Klan was a white supremacist employers association. And there were a cross-class group of people who held membership in the Klan, but the leadership, for the most part, were elites or downwardly mobile elites, folks who suffered in the wake of the American Civil War. They suffered in the face of what Du Bois called a general strike of the enslaved people who played a big part in their own emancipation. And they did not want these people to get educated. They did not want them to vote. They did not want them to participate in politics. They did not like the Freedmen's Bureau and its involvement in labor relations. And so their violence in many ways was strategic. And they saw these outside forces as very problematic. Education in particular. They said education would destroy, one Klansman said, education would destroy the value of Negro labor, right? Negro labor, right? Schooling took folks away from workplaces, promoted critical thinking, particularly at a time when these folks were complaining. They complained about labor shortages. So what did they do? Of course, they whipped, they killed, they engaged in a number of drive-out operations, particularly involving Northern teachers, right? So they would show up at the teacher's home and they would say, "You better get out of here, or else, you're going to face the wrath later on." And so I have a few anecdotes in my book where I talk about the strategic mobilization of Klansmen. And what did they want? They wanted subordinate former enslaved people working on the farms, the plantations, the kitchens, and they wanted what they called law and order. They went after the guns. They went after books. They burned schools. They burned books. They were very interested in controlling the narrative, and of course they did kill. But I think killing was probably not the immediate motivation many times. And so, yes, they went away. At least officially, in the early 1870s, because the U.S. government used the Enforcement Acts and the Ku Klux Klan Act. There are some trials, and a number of whom left the Klan but did not necessarily abandon vigilantism. And so some of the worst violence happened after the Klan sort of officially dissolved. And I'm thinking of the Colfax Massacre. Some of you folks have heard of this, I assume, in 1873, when you have a group of lightly armed black militiamen and white terrorists who the black militiamen had occupied the courthouse, supporting one political candidate, the Republican candidate for governor at that time. The whites supported the Democrat candidate, and they went in and they slaughtered probably about 150 folks at this time, and it was absolutely brutal event. They shot occupants, they left them on the ground to die, and their leaders, one of whom was a guy named William Cruikshank, instructed his followers to kill the N-word. And so this was what Eric Foner calls the worst act of terrorism in the Reconstruction period. The aftermath of the event is as important as the event itself. The case, they were some of those who were involved in the violence were tried, and eventually only 3 were charged, and they got off at the at one level, and then the case made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically said the 14th Amendment about equal rights did not apply, and they were left free. And so this was quite a travesty of justice, most would argue. And in the aftermath, we see the emergence of some of the white leagues, which were like the Klan, interested in preventing African Americans from voting and insisting that they and using violence to ensure that they did little other than work during their waking hours. So I think, looking at all of this, whether we talk about the Klan, we talk about the vigilantes involved in the Colfax Massacre, we can agree that that was terrorism. So I talk a lot about the Klan, but then I move and look at what law and order leagues. Law and order leagues have not left as much of a they haven't left as much of a legacy, of course, as the Klan, and they certainly were not nearly as violent or as thuggish, but they were critical in undermining the interests of labor. And so what we see in 1886 is this massive Southwest Railroad strike against Jay Gould's railroad empire. And this was a huge event that found expression in multiple states and involved, some people say, as many as 200,000 participants. And much of the action, or a lot of the action, happened in Sedalia, Missouri. I don't know if folks have ever been to Sedalia or have heard of it, but it's a railroad town and was home to a pretty strong Knights of Labor presence there. Knights of Labor was behind this strike, including one of its leaders, a guy named Martin Irons. And in response to the mobilization of this massive strike, we see the emergence of a private sector group, again called the Law and Order League. It was led in part by a guy named J. Wes Goodwin, who owned a newspaper there. And what these people did was they helped strikebreakers cross picket lines. They intimidated strikers. They held guns, and this Law and Order League movement spread to other communities as well, including small towns like Parsons, Kansas, Logansport, Indiana, and other places around mostly the Midwest, but to a lesser extent in the South as well. And so lots of intimidation involved in these Law and Order Leagues. They complemented rather than competed competed with public sector security forces, and were, according to J. West Goodwin's own newspaper, they were the number one reason why the strike failed, at least in Sedalia. Workers ended up going back, or scabs took their job. Well, most workers did not go back. Their strike breakers took their jobs, and the strike was mostly over by the end of April. And so these people in the Law and Order League were not simply interested in confronting strikers directly. They also sought to punish its leaders, including, of course, Martin Irons. And so J. West Goodwin used his paper to really vilify the reputation of Irons and others. And so blacklisting became this sort of soft form of terrorism. It impacted both the direct targets and those who remained at work sites, and really demonstrated to others the consequences of labor militancy. And so Irons ends up moving around, goes to St. Louis, goes to Fort Worth, Texas. He's in Little Rock for a little while, I believe, and he ends up eventually settling in the late 19th century in outside of Waco, Texas, where he was fairly impoverished, but never abandoned his political his politics, his left-leaning politics, and so the idea here is to really to stigmatize people. The number of folks who returned to the Missouri Pacific was something like 200, like less than 200, which was a small fraction of the about 4,600 who had worked there before the strike. So back to Sedalia, back to some of these other communities, prosperity resumed. The Missouri Pacific Company continued to have its trains serviced in the community, and this was, a nice example again of the relationship between sort of armed vigilantes and intimidation and the resumption of commerce and prosperity. Shift focus somewhere else. I have a chapter on northern Idaho, where you have these two massive confrontations in 1892 and again in 1899. So you have an effort to break the unions. Employers bring in strike breakers. The unions challenge the strike breakers. It gets violent in both cases, and you have the two governors in two different contexts invoking or declaring martial law, and we have National Guard troops and federal troops, as well as Law and Order League members in 1892 confronting protesters. And perhaps the most dramatic expression of this conflict was the creation of what they call bullpens. These were sort of stockade type things where they imprisoned everybody, and they just kind of mass arrested people, threw them in these bullpens, first in 1892 and again in 1899. No due process for a while, and then brought in, were able to break the unions, bring in non-union workers. Now, what's interesting about the 1892 event is that at least some of the folks incarcerated, both in the bullpen as well as in the Ada County Jail down in Boise, were talked about building a stronger union, and the following year, members of from Idaho, as well as other parts of the West, formed the Western Federation of Miners, which became one of the more militant unions in U.S. history, for that matter. And so the union, the Western Federation of Miners, played a critical role in protests in 1899. Most dramatically, there was a hijacking of a train that filled with dynamite that ended up destroying the Bunker Hill and Sullivan, one of the big employers there, ore concentrator in 1899. There's dispute if this was the work of actual union activists or it was agent provocateurs. Hard to say, but after that we see, again, more clampdowns and throwing people in these bullpens. And conditions were, as one person put it, as bad as Siberia, right? 3 people died in 1899. They were not fed food for a while. The conditions were awful, but anyway, it worked, right? The union, the Western Federation of Miners, in that period was ultimately crushed, and the labor activists referred to northern Idaho, the Coeur d'Alenes, as the worst corporate-controlled state or the region in the country. So the combination of caging unionists and transporting non-unionists ultimately worked, and just like Klansmen could celebrate or former Klansmen could celebrate the birth of the New South and the end of Reconstruction, and Law and Order Leagues could celebrate the destruction or the defeat of the 1886 strike. So too could these folks in northern Idaho. Okay, so thus far I've talked a little bit about whippings. I've talked a little bit about caging, intimidating workers with guns. How about kidnapping? This was another practice, rare but certainly important in some cases, most notably in Tampa. Maybe some of you have heard about this case. A cigar workers union called La Resistencia, an anarchist, largely Cuban-led union, staged a massive 5,000-person strike in 1901 against these cigar factories, and the members of business community formed what they called a citizens committee, which then kidnapped 13 of the leaders, put them on a boat, and brought them to Honduras and left them there. How about that? And so this one of the folks was this guy D.B. McKay, who I write a lot about in the book. The kidnapped men eventually made it back to Tampa, and they sought help from the Justice Department. McKinley they went to the McKinley administration, who was dying at the moment in early September, and the district attorney, U.S. District Attorney, went and said, I don't see any law breaking here. This was reported in the news. And was well known. And so this guy Stripling, J.B. Stripling, I think is his name, was the district attorney and met with both sides and basically said, no, there's no issue. I don't see any laws broken here. So the ultimate enabler. And then so other folks wrote about this, and this is a great technique. Kidnapping. This is something that we can do in other places. They refer to it as the new solution. The new solution. So kidnapping labor activists was the new solution. And they would. The strike continued after they were kidnapped, and they also shut down soup kitchens. They destroyed the union's press. They kidnapped some more people, sent them to New Orleans, and ultimately the strike fizzled out, and La Resistencia was no longer a factor in Tampa by 1902. So note this idea, citizens alliance. We have a lot of citizens associations, citizens alliances. It doesn't sound especially ominous now, does it, right? Citizens, we're all citizens. These folks were involved in all sorts of anti-labor activities, and they, including members who were participants in earlier vigilante organizations, including the Montana Vigilantes, various Stockgrowers associations, the Klan, and the Law and Order Leagues. And they use language, I think, fairly effectively, right? They supported the open shop as opposed to the closed shop, right? They talked, rather than discuss challenging the dangerous classes, they talked about protecting the common people, right? That is, you're going to help the non-union strikebreaker, right? There were chapters in over 500 chapters in by 1910. So this is very so thousands and thousands of employers, but also lawyers and maybe clergymen, senators, Congress people, very powerful. And so they became especially notorious in Colorado during the so-called mine wars, 1903, 1904. Many historians have written about this. I'm not new here, but I do want to point out that this was quite a thuggish campaign where you see expulsion, you have drive-out campaigns. The governor, who was a member of the Citizens Alliance there, declared martial law. You have kidnapping. You have another Supreme Court case involving the leader of the Western Federation of Miners at the time, Charles Moyer, who was snatched and was upset about having no due process, and the Supreme Court unanimously sided with Peabody, James Peabody, who's the governor of Colorado, and again a member of the Citizens Alliance there, and very dramatic. And some historians have said, some of the kidnapping involved that they participated in Colorado, that they may have been inspired by those in Tampa, right? So employers they learned from one another. They took people's guns. They raided their homes. The Citizens Alliance worked collaboratively with the National Guard. Some National Guardsmen were members of the Citizens Alliances, and so they deported something like more than 200 people involved in the Union, put them on trains and sent them to New Mexico and Kansas. And in Cripple Creek, pretty cleverly, the Citizens Alliances there ordered pins. They ordered 3,000 pins for the citizens of that community, and the pins said they can't come back. They can't come back. So here's everybody wearing these pins. They said that everybody who's opposed to the Western Federation of Miners should wear these pins. One of the leaders of the Citizens Alliance was J. West Goodwin, a figure who was active in the Law and Order League in the 1880s. He reemerges as a major organizer. He referred to himself as the Christopher Columbus of the Citizens Alliance movement, right? This is a way to sort of celebrate that he was some kind of pioneer. And he talked openly, or at least in his letters to other members of the Citizens Alliance, he said, we got to be very secretive. We need to embrace lots of different techniques because the secrecy strikes terror. He used that word in a letter to a fellow Citizens Alliance member in Minneapolis. He said, it strikes terror to the ranks of organized labor. Right? Use the word terror. And so he was active in helping to set up a branch at Scranton, Pennsylvania, in Pensacola, Florida. He was in St. Louis. He's all over. He said he organized about 30 different Citizens Alliances. And so these folks were active on the ground in sort of building public relations against labor. They collaborated with prosecutors. They put up money for the arrests of strikers involved in violent activities. They helped oversee strike breaking and the delivery of strike breakers. And they had a set of talking points that insisted that they were, the good guys. They were there to protect the common people. They were opposed to the closed shop, and so framing was very important. Now, as far as narrative creators is concerned, we have some very important ones, including Owen Worcester, who worked for the Citizens Alliance, Citizens Industrial Alliance of America. That's the big umbrella group that united all these people in doing propaganda. They had a propaganda committee. Owen Worcester, if you don't know, is the author of the world-famous book, The Virginian. It's a book about Western vigilantism, and he worked for this organization and helped disseminate propaganda. Hired by C.W. Post, the breakfast food guy, and like Others talked about strikebreakers as heroes, talked about the importance of law and order. And the book itself, The Virginian, has this line in it where the main character, where Judge Henry, one of the boss of the main character, the Virginian, tells him that you can get justice by the law or popular justice. The law or popular justice, meaning essentially that if the courts did not rule the way they wanted, then popular justice meaning sort of vigilante justice. And so I look at this book and see in that the Worcester's words that this might have inspired employer vigilantes later on who were involved in confronting strikers in places like Cheyenne. Now, the Virginian is loosely based on the Johnson County War. The Johnson County War, or the Johnson County Raid of 1892, involved about 50 vigilantes, most of whom were privileged, some Pinkertons, who went up to Johnson County and went to attack. They had a 70-person kill list. They wanted to attack rustlers. These are really small landowners, who they called rustlers. And they went in and they shot and they killed 2 people. And then the people of Johnson County rose up and fought back. The governor, Amos Barber, who was friends with the vigilantes, collaborated with Benjamin Harrison, the president, and got these people protection. And the case never went to trial. These folks who shot and killed these people were able to get off. And so this was a public relations disaster for the members of this posse. But Owen Worcester was friends with them, some of them, and some say that the Virginian was a book that was designed to rehabilitate the reputation of these elite vigilantes. And so it was an enormously popular book, and it also he also helped the open shop movement and continued to collaborate with some of these people who were involved in union busting later on. So some of the same people who were involved in the Johnson County War were involved in Citizens Alliance activities in Cheyenne and elsewhere in Wyoming. And so public relations was very important to members of these union busting organizations, and Worcester was an outstanding asset to them because of his prestige as an author, both the author of fiction and nonfiction. So clearly, organized labor's opponents really worked quite hard, built fairly sturdy organizations, use public relations in often in an effective way, I think it's fair to say. And so the outcome, what can we say? Violence from above really helped to protect their economic interests. The economic interests of business communities may seem obvious, but this is a point that traditional accounts of the rise of the U.S. as a major industrial power sort of tend not to emphasize. We get stories about the development of patents and the broad-mindedness of entrepreneurs and engineers, not the messy work of hard, soft, and hybrid forms of repression. And so in the South, the Southern vigilantes, the violence there led to what Du Bois called the counter-revolution of property at the end of the Reconstruction period. Property owners won, Southern employers developed new industries, and these bosses made money off the backs of white and black workers alike. The mobilization of law and order leagues in Midwestern and Southern communities helped put down strikes, expel radicals, and blacklist activists. The repressive campaign against the Western Federation of Miners in northern Idaho and Colorado led to fruitful results for these people. Of course, they did not eliminate the labor problem, but they certainly did obtain some victories. And so is this history relevant today? I think what we see are cases of white male privileged violence that we might call terrorism. And certainly those involved in the January 6th insurrection were we're talking about small business owners, some CEOs, some managers, some off-duty cops. This was not an anti-labor battle, but certainly ideologically they probably shared much in common with the Klansmen from the late 19th century, and certainly Law and Order League folks in that period as well. We see other right-wing forces that we might want to call other forms of terrorism, including vehicular terrorism. We've seen Black Lives Matter and anti-fascist rallies on picket lines where scabs and managers drive their cars into protesters, and some politicians want to make it legal for drivers to engage in such acts of thuggery. We can identify present-day enablers. And so what I have sought to do here is kind of show a long history of elite forms of violence, and to rescue the word terrorism from the anti-labor spokespersons of the turn of the century and from today's Islamophobes. So we'll end it there. Thank you.
Okay, Chad, thanks very much. We can begin the conversation now, and I just ask people, if you have a question or comment, just type the word stack, S-T-A-C-K, in the chat, and we'll add you to the speakers, to the stack of speakers. Or you can use the little hand-raising function in the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. There is a question already in the chat from Carl. Carl, I don't know if you'd like to verbalize that question yourself, or we can just read it out of the chat. You're muted right at the moment. Carl, if you're speaking, you need to unmute.
I'd be happy for Chad to just answer the question. I think everybody can see it. I guess I could just preface it by saying that this is such a wonderful talk by Chad that kind of corrects and balances the whole one-sided conception of the Klan as, just some kind of anti-Black, crazy white racism. And he contextualizes this and historicizes it. But it made me wonder, and everything that Chad has been talking about has been primarily about these terrorist attack on organized labor, not so much a focus on Black people. So it made me wonder, is this whole emphasis on the Klan's anti-racism, obviously it seems to have been very exaggerated, but I wonder, given this new focus that Chad is bringing, does that mean that the Klan's attacks on Blacks were actually a more minor part of their activity compared to their general attack on labor in general? Or was it still, their primary or, one of their main functions, which is the way that the Klan has always talked about?
If I may, thank you so much for your kind words. I really appreciate that a lot. And so thinking about the Klan, I think that, well, in general, what we see in a lot of discourse is this idea of hate. And they certainly did not hate the folks responsible for creating the wealth. Here I'm referring to planter Klansmen and those in more privileged positions. I've encountered a document that I cite in my book from the Klan, and I don't know the author of it, but I have no reason to disprove its authenticity. And it says, we support, as long, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something along the lines of, as long as white and Black people do engage in their appropriate labor, we will protect them, right? Appropriate labor, right? And so what they didn't want were these teachers who took them away from the work sites. Okay, that they didn't want critical thinking. So there are cases of Klansmen, attacking or isolating and attacking these teachers and telling them to pack up and leave. There are cases of other cases of I cite one of a woman, African American woman who was cooking and she just quit. She didn't want to have her job anymore. And Klansmen went and kidnapped her and brought her back and said, in no uncertain terms, you're going to continue to work for Mr. Whatever his name was. And so physically bringing her back to work. There's another case of a Klansman in Alabama this guy Honeycutt, who couldn't get any labor, and he was really upset about that. He said, "I can't get a darky for any price," he said. And what he ended up doing was getting together with his friends, he hid under a house where former enslaved people were organizing in this union league, and then he had two pistols. He clutched to this pistol. He confronted them. He said, you better stop this. Come work for me, or there's going to be a problem. And then he and his Klansmen rode down to the black neighborhood. And then some elders, some African American elders, met with Honeycutt and said, "Hey, look, whatever you need, we'll take care of it." And the next day, he saw 27 workers on his plantation, and then they worked for him for free. He said, and then we made peace, right? So that kind of intimidation, right? He couldn't get labor. He couldn't get anybody to cut his cotton, and he used a combination of different intimidation tactics that ultimately forced these people to go back. Nathan Bedford Forrest himself said, as soon as he learned about the Klan, that's a great thing. We can get the N-word to stay in his place. So, I hope that helps.
So, did you feel that that the racial attacks were actually a minor part or a subsidiary part of this much broader movement? Or do you feel that there was some kind of independence to it, and there was a kind of hatred of blacks, and there was, all kinds of, the racist things that we hear about? They were opposed to interracial sex or, marriage. And was that just a minor part, or how does that fit into all this?
Well, I would frame it this way. I would say that rather than talk about racism as sort of a behavioral phenomenon, think about the political economy of racism. In other words, right, where did African Americans belong in their view, right? Working, right? Basically working. During their waking hours, they needed to be working and not voting, not receiving an education, not engaged in politics. And so, that sounds, kind of slightly reductionist, I guess, but I think it kind of makes sense. So it's still racist, and there's still killings, there's still beatings, there's still this sense of white supremacy, right? But it's what was their end goal, right? It's not just to kill, hurt black people for being black. It's about they serve a function.
Richard Myers, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, Chad, for this needed corrective to the predominant class view on terrorism.
Thank you.
My question stems from, as you noted at the beginning, and I think probably everybody who would agree with you, that those in power in a capitalist society define the means of relating to working people and try to define the means by which working people relate to their own experience. So with that in mind, from what you've examined and applying it to today, do you think that capitalists today, say first, are just following in the vein of historical practice of terrorism because that's what capitalists do and they need that to perpetuate their own control? Or do you think that you see any evidence that capitalists today actually look back at these past experiences and consciously are learning from what happened and then trying to apply that in the conditions of today? Now, as a historian, I'm always happy when people learn from history, but this is not the kind of example I think that I'd like to see. But have you found anything that would lead you to believe that people are actually looking back at these historical examples?
That's interesting. I think in the case of, say, anti-unionism more broadly, I think we can see a broad pattern rhetorically, right? Anti-union ideas, open shop, right to work. These ideas sort of emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century, and we can still see how folks in positions of power apply them. On the question of violence, I don't see as much in the way of sort of direct violence. What's interesting about this early period is that these folks got their hands dirty, right? They went in and they engaged in drive-out campaigns and in exceptional cases the kidnapping. I have heard cases of bosses at restaurants and bars and hitting workers, and workers call the cops and nothing happens to the boss for doing that sort of thing. But today I think when class struggles become more pronounced, the police will probably do most of the heavy hitting, I would think. And so I'll leave it at that. I don't know if that helps answer your question. I don't know of. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry about this. The sharing the screen. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Let's go to Mark. You're muted.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Hi, Mark. Great to see you.
Hi, it's good to see you. As always, I really enjoy your work, and I think you have a really interesting approach on this, and it's very informative in terms of what we've seen happening
Thank you.
now. There are a couple things I would add, though, I think might be helpful. The Citizens Alliance, we've talked about this at different points. The Citizens Alliance is an organization that actually shows up at conventions of the populist.
Right.
You have the Farmers Alliance, you have the Citizens Alliance. And it's interesting that the kind of rhetoric that they engage in is much like the rhetoric allied to passive encouragement of violence in the part of the political right today.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that absolutely confuses people in the media all the time. If Trump is going to do something like weaponize the Justice Department, he'll accuse people of weaponizing the Justice Department, right?
Right.
So it's not just simply sort of co-opting populist rhetoric. They're deliberately capturing the language that you need
Mm-hmm.
To even describe what they're doing.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting insight in all that. The question of race, I've been working on Reconstruction in Virginia, and I actually think that we have I haven't read the new book on the history of the Klan, recent book on the history of the Klan, origins of the Klan, but I think that historians have generally kind of missed this notion of the arc of history in the early Ku Klux Klan. It disappears not because the government is cracking down on it very much.
Mm-hmm.
They're closing the door, the barn door, long after the cows are gone,
Mm-hmm.
right? 3 months after Appomattox, you have accounts in the Washington Press and the Virginia newspapers of groups of people, on horses in Confederate uniforms, riding the back country of Virginia, and basically the suburbs of Washington today,
Mm-hmm.
terrorizing people. And in a sense, this is an extension of how they governed things, how the elite in the South governed things before the war. There are just one account after the other. The interesting thing about the Reconstruction is it's now become really a labor issue. A lot of what's taking place in Virginia in particular, but I'm sure it's in other places as well, is that there is a real co-op movement, a cooperative movement,
Mm-hmm.
that's partly coincides with what the early Knights of Labor are doing, what the Grange is doing. Only in rural Virginia, it's blacks with white allies, and until they get run out.
Right.
But this is happening before the government is even acknowledging that there's anything going on there. There's all sorts of rhetoric about how bad things are, but nothing's actually done about it until it's too late to actually maintain those institutions. I was also thinking in terms of the Citizens Alliance, it makes you think of the White Citizens Council, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. I wanted to know if there are any connections. I haven't found any, but it's, the framing is important, I think.
Yeah, I think the framing is really there. Also, some of these other things we were talking about, the white leagues and pale faces,
Mm-hmm.
and the various other manifestations of essentially the Klan that managed to survive.
The Knights of the White Camellia as well in Louisiana.
The White Camellia in Louisiana, yeah. Tennessee's got a good half dozen of them.
Right. No, I mean these,
But the flip side of this thing about using violence to repress labor is this question of getting involved with the movement. Kind of like the Citizens Alliance did. I think I mentioned to you at one point that when they try to start a section of the First International in Nashville.
Okay.
And the people who show up and basically take over the meeting and kill it are members of the Order of Pale Faces.
Oh, jeez.
Right. So I don't think that reflects badly on the populace or the international.
Right.
It's a demonstration of how flexible these people are.
Right. No, that's true.
So it's repression, but also related to that, it's the same sort of people who are involved in dissolving the movement wherever possible.
Right.
Right. It's the leading committees of the Green Party that's a revolving door to the local Democrats, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, co-optation. I mean, that's part of it, and I don't get into that, but your work does. So that's key.
Well, I think it's interesting. It's the same people who are doing both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Like that. What do you find?
So go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, what did you find particularly in terms of Sedalia?
Sedalia, that it's where the Law and Order League emerged and was instrumental in putting down the strike. And so what these folks did, it's not entirely clear, but they were armed men who would help strike breakers cross picket lines and basically bully strikers, and then totally stigmatize people like Martin Irons. They also, after that strike, a delegation of Law and Order League members go and meet with Hoaxie, who's just under Jay Gould, and they basically say, hey, look, you don't have to worry about anything anymore because we've got law and order under control. We are going to protect property, and you can continue to invest in Sedalia. Now, Hoaxie, H.M. Hoaxie, I think is his name, the second in command after Jay Gould. Hoaxie says, I didn't really have a very favorable opinion of Sedalia in the past, but since you folks emerged and were able to take care of law and order, I'm sure we'll continue to. We're going to build a new facility in Sedalia. So it's and then I don't have direct evidence, but I see notes of many of these Knights of Labor members being run out of Sedalia in the aftermath of that strike, not just Martin Irons, but others. And so so this guy J. West Goodwin, who ran a newspaper, is critical. He's important, and he is behind the board of trade there, and publishes Banker magazine. It's not terribly exciting stuff, but he's very pro business, and so they're pretty united, the business community there, and we're effective. They also have judges and folks in the public sector. The mayor is a leader of the Law and Order League as well. He sells these. He's involved in mule trading and very successful. So so they're quite a hodgepodge.
Joe Shelby's old operation.
Yeah. There you go.
That press connection is really interesting because in talking about co-optation and deflection along with repression, control of the newspapers as they're coming up is essential.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of colorful articles, denouncing Martin Irons, and they said that if Martin Irons returned, that the workers would greet him with a shower of ancient eggs. That the workers, so to take it away from the bosses and say it's the workers who are pissed,
So I had a question or
Sure.
a comment. I'm just was trying to kind of puzzle out in my mind the if there's a useful distinction to make between these kind of local level what you call terrorists, anti-labor terrorists who engage in violent and repressive activities against strikers and unions and workers' organizations from one local area to the next, on the one hand. And then cases like January 6th, and I don't think there is another case at the national level of outright efforts to overthrow or the state. Certainly, there's instances during Reconstruction in New Orleans and Wilmington.
Right, Wilmington's key.
Other places, but for the most part, the phenomena that you're describing are, people engaged in repression of labor, but not outright fascists who have an overall program for transforming the state in a reactionary fashion that we saw in January 6th, and that, of course, classically we saw in Italy or Germany or Spain or whatever in the 30s.
And Brazil recently.
There were movements in the United States like that. There was Father Coughlin, the Silver Shirts. But how big a distinction is there between those kinds of groups on the one hand and the ones that your subject matter pertains to?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I don't see these folks seeking to overthrow the state, other than I do mention Wilmington in the book briefly, because the class position of those was similar to those involved in the union busting and strike breaking. But this book is mostly about labor and management and broadly defined, and how those the relationship between vigilantism and management, and how they use violence to solve their labor-related problems. I don't know. I mean, they're involved in politics. They support certain candidates. Typically the Republican Party, the Democratic Party in the South, and there are members of these there are politicians who are members of these organizations as well. So you have this public-private these coalitions. But no, I don't know of any case other than Wilmington where it's an overthrow or an attempt to overthrow.
Yeah. Alana?
Hey, thank you for this. Maybe this is just a comment or a question that is not particularly relevant. I don't know. But all I was thinking about is, and I'm not an academic, I'm not a teacher, I'm not involved with teacher or curriculums. What I could think about is that how you're telling this flip side of the Klan, which is that it's not simply about white supremacy, but about the necessity of labor. That would be a part of a critical race theory that will be completely objectionable to any of the people on the right seeking to crush and repress teachers and students from learning these histories. So maybe that's just a comment.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to think about today's climate and all these anti-CRT efforts and anti-trans stuff, because Florida tour, because they're not using vigil. Well, actually, they are. I mean, I live in Denton, Texas, and there was a reading of LGBT reading group, and they're Proud Boys who showed up and tried to put it down. Yeah. So you do see, right? You have at the state level, right? DeSantis and others, making a case that you shouldn't have this stuff, and then you have the mobilization of these far right folks as well. And so this history goes back, right? I mean, the Klan torched tons of schools. I know tons, but I think a good number. I've seen references to many or quite a few. They burned books. They drove out teachers. In those cases, they simply did not want an educated black population. And then later on, you have, of course, the destruction of socialist printing presses. You have the anti-IWW campaigns, and particularly in the West Coast, the anti-free speech stuff happening. So information suppression is very there's a long history.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question or comment?
I do.
Carl, we can go back to you if no one else would like to speak first. I don't see anyone, so go ahead, Carl.
Okay. I just wonder if Chad has information about the political economic context to the white raids in Oklahoma on the middle class black communities that were supposedly attacked because they posed some kind of expression of black success. But I wonder if you know whether that was also part of an attack on labor, because I don't really.
He's shredding paper over here.
I don't see how that would, relate to suppression of black labor, except if they wanted to suppress blacks from, entering the middle class. Would you say that that's how it relates to your, analysis?
Yeah, no, I think it is related, and again, this might sound simplistic, but Ida B. Wells made the interesting point when she looked at lynchings, and she said it wasn't just about the the so-called black beast rapists, but it was also about black success in competition, and the competition that they posed to white business owners looking at grocery shop owners in Memphis, and so we can apply that to the Tulsa tragedy, right? I mean, ultimately, folks in power, they don't want African Americans. They didn't want African Americans to be successful. They didn't want them to engage in politics. And so in some ways, this effort to destroy the so-called Black Wall Street is very consistent, I think, with that idea that the African American population needed to work, right? I mean, again, it sounds simple, but I think the evidence is there to sustain that position.
But then, just to relate to that, how do you explain the acceptance and the welcoming of Asian business success? I mean, Asians are fantastically successful, and you don't have, now you don't have that kind of hostility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say I don't know if it's as much of a factor in more recent times. Certainly with respect to either African Americans or Asian Americans, but certainly up through probably the 1920s, you probably have that. And indeed, there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment as well. I mean, maybe one way to kind of think about race, the relationship between race and class, and historians have said a whole lot about this, is to say, okay, you have, racism among the white working class that's, could have been based on hate, and we see these anti-Asian attacks, anti-Chinese efforts in the 19th century, and anti-black efforts in some trade unions. But those at the top of society, the bosses, wanted to exploit these people, and so they would pay African Americans less, they would pay Asian Americans less, and then pit them against one another. So I see, we can identify racism as hate and racism as exploitation, and other forms of racism too. Yeah. Who's next?
Anyone?
Jacqueline, yes. I wanted to counter that Asian success that's a mischaracterization. The internment in World War II was felt by many Japanese Americans to be an attack upon their success in farms. I mean, they had in the Bay Area, California, there were very many successful Japanese farmers, and they felt that the internment was a way to get their land cheaply. So they had sell. They were forced to sell, and they had to sell refrigerators. There is a great resentment in the Chinese American community that in UC Berkeley, no American-born Chinese has ever become a high position at UC Berkeley. It's always foreign Chinese who are hired. So it's very complex. There's especially, I mean, I lived in the Bay Area for 25 years, and there's great resentment between the Chinese and African American community, and it's the perfect example of groups being posed against each other. And it's very destructive, and there are efforts to alleviate it. But I don't think you could in any way counter that Asians have had greater success in the United States than other groups. Just look at the pogroms in San Francisco, the nativist parties in San Francisco, Texas, the way Chinese Americans were exploited for building the railroads, never allowed to settle in towns. So at the present, there may be a feeling of success, but amongst Chinese Americans, there's real resentment and also fear, because the women I know who are Chinese American tell me they're afraid to go on subways now. And so to see that the success of a few people does not at all characterize and also it's a huge population, right? I mean, you have Southeast Asians, you have Vietnamese, so it's very complex. But I wouldn't say that Asians have had noted success. I mean, come on, where's the Asian president?
Yeah, well said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any further comments, questions, discussion? Chad, once again, it's been really a wonderful presentation and conversation, and we're eager to have you back. What's your next project?
I don't know for sure yet. Maybe I want to do an edited book on management and vigilantism throughout history. So I wouldn't do it. So if anybody's interested in participating, we should chat. But thank you so much for having me. This was a real honor, and it's great to be here.